Parks Victoria acknowledges traditional owners throughout Victoria and pays respect to their culture and elders past, present and future. This episode of Closer to Nature was recorded in Naarm, Melbourne, on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and at Wilson's Promontory National Park. Wilson's Promontory is a highly significant living cultural landscape for the Gunai-Kurnai, Boonwurrung and Bunurong people. Parks Victoria respects the deep and continuing connection that traditional owners have to these lands and waters, and we recognise their ongoing role in caring for country.
We're at Wilson's Promontory National Park today, which is the southernmost tip of the Australian continent, which makes it a fairly significant place for a number of reasons. It is full of unique biodiversity, and because of its geographical shape, being linked to the mainland by a narrow peninsula or isthmus, it puts us in a really good position to use that to our advantage. This is where the Prom Sanctuary project has originated from. Basically, it means that by putting 10 kilometres of fencing across that narrow neck of land, we protect tens of thousands of hectares from potential predators coming into the park.
This is Mark Antos. Mark is manager of the Biodiversity Science team at Parks Victoria. We've met up with him today at Wilson's Promontory, where he and others are helping build a landscape-scale climate refuge known as the Prom Sanctuary. We'll be hearing more from Mark soon, and how he orchestrated a daring rescue and helped save a rare native bird from one of the worst fires in living memory.
We could actually go in there just before the fire got there, grab as many as we could and get them the hell out of there, out of harm's way.
Welcome to Closer to Nature, a Parks Victoria podcast. I'm Mark Norman, Chief Scientist, Conservation and Climate Action at Parks Victoria. Throughout this series, we've looked at the impact climate change is having on the natural and cultural values in parks. And we've spoken with rangers and other experts about the work they're doing to help protect them. In this final episode, I'm going to talk about how we best help nature in the future. We're adapting our game plan as we learn more and as things change in these unpredictable times. I went down to Wilson's Promontory National Park to discuss a new way of thinking. It's called the RAD Framework. That's nice. That's the New Holland Honeyeater. We're sitting on 5 Mile track at Wilson's Promontory National Park, or Yurik as the traditional owner name for this site. We're in an open Banksia woodland with grass trees and bracken and Banksias that have flowered and seeded all around us from past planned burns. And it's a beautiful spot for birds and all sorts of great critters. I think the times we're living in and the climate change challenge is sort of shocking everybody. The speed and scale and scope of what's going on is pretty dramatic, and I think traditional owners and ecologists are really aware of how fast things are changing. We see all the time on the news climate change impacts around the world, floods, fires, massive cyclones, heatwave events in oceans, all sorts of things. I think there's something about climate change being seen as those major events, the big fires, the big floods, droughts, major storm events. Sometimes it's less obvious, but it is definitely happening. So it might be systems where a gradual drying out has caused the major tree species in a system to struggle and die. Some of this stuff is whacking us where we didn't expect it, and some of it is really obvious. But I think the public will, people visiting parks or going out in nature will see that things are strange or are changed. It doesn't mean nature is doomed, and it doesn't mean nature can't find ways to persist. It just may be an adjustment. The RAD framework is a way of thinking about climate change and acting in a way that's really positive and constructive to the challenges we all face. The RAD bit stands for Resist, Accept, Direct. And it was coined by a group of United States National Park Service and Geological Survey to deal with the sorts of whole landscape or whole ecosystem transformations they're seeing going on in the US and Canada. So it's a way of thinking about and being honest about climate change, but also finding really constructive, positive things to do to help nature in these challenging times. There's some good examples of the RAD framework in the United States. So we went to Joshua Tree National Park in Southern California, and they're going through a sort of existential crisis of we've got a national park called the Joshua Tree National Park, and our Joshua trees are in trouble. What can we do? And so they're thinking around RAD framework, this Resist, Accept, Direct framework, is there's things you can do in different parts of the landscape that are true or realistic to sort of what's going on. So on the low elevations in Joshua Tree National Park, the Joshua trees are no longer reproducing. It's been too hot, too dry. They're just gradually growing old and dying out without young coming through, no juveniles in the system. On the higher altitudes, it's cool enough and a little bit more moist, and all the Joshua trees are doing well. They're making seeds, they're making babies. It's all working well. So that's a sort of refuge at higher altitudes. And then some parts of the park had bushfires up to 20 years ago and still haven't had Joshua trees come back. So that's kind of like a blank canvas within the park. So if you think of the RAD framework, Resist, Accept, Direct, you resist in your refuges. They're the really important places where you keep Joshua trees alive and healthy and breeding and reproducing. You accept that there's going to be a gradual loss of those Joshua trees on the flats. You accept that transition and do other things instead to save the species or that habitat type. Maybe move them further north towards poles where it's a bit cooler or a bit moister. And then the areas that are the blank canvases, they're sort of like the direct options or parts of the landscape. So where the fires have left that blank canvas, then you could bring species that are in trouble further south in their case, so where it's hotter, from Mexico, or desert systems that need somewhere to live, like endangered cactuses or rare reptiles, assist the migration of species that need somewhere else to live. So in that one national park, you've got a resist refuge up in high country, you've got an accept gradual transition on the low elevations, and then you've got an area where you can start creating a pocket of new nature. It's a good example of how you go resist in one, accept in one, and direct in one. And that lens is a really important one for us across our national parks estate. So for us in Victoria, the RAD framework gives us a sort of lens to look through of how we can do more for nature. Probably our best example of resist is Uruak-Wamoon, also known as Wilson's Promontory National Park, where the whole landmass sits out in the cool waters of Bass Strait, so it's naturally buffered temperature-wise. So it's always 5 to 10 degrees cooler than the adjacent mainland. It's also the very southern tip of Australia, so if there's a place you're going to kind of hold out, it's such a natural place to do it. And so we think of this place and the Prom Sanctuary project as a really clear resist candidate, and it covers 9 major ecosystems, and we're up to 153 threatened species found there. And so our Prom Sanctuary project is built around the idea of a predator and deer exclusion fence across the 10-kilometre width of that peninsular entrance to the park. And that becomes a sort of a bulwark against the sort of onslaught, and then we can get on or continue to ramp up the pest and weed control within the park. It's a really good example of where we're going to do everything to help nature. In terms of an example of an accept landscape, there's a past salt works near Geelong out of Melbourne in Victoria that is a really critical spot for endangered migratory birds that fly in from Siberia and do their cycle between summers in different hemispheres. And they're on the salt pans, but the sea level is rising and it's starting to impact that system. So it's a staged retreat accept where we will manage the transformations to allow the water to come in gradually, but the salt marsh and the seagrass will come back naturally in the flooded bits, and we'll just try and keep those pools open, those salt pans that those migratory birds need to roost on or feed on. It'll be a staged retreat. So that's sort of accepting that we're going backwards inland, and we might do special things to help those species by setting up other places that are suitable for them elsewhere. But that's a kind of a staged retreat accept example. When it comes to a direct example, I think we've got landscapes impacted by the Black Summer fires, which were gigantic, 15 million hectares across eastern Australia. We've got areas where salt's coming in and it's affecting the roots of trees that were high enough not to have salty water in coastal systems. And we've got places where the frequency of fire has really challenged some of our big trees like the mountain ash and the alpine ash that need 25 years between burns to make their babies grow big enough to make their own seed. So that's where we might direct a different outcome. We might bring in eucalypt species that do better in fire, but still make a canopy, still help the plants and animals that live under that forest canopy, instead of it just being uniform wattle or uniform kind of low grass habitat. So we might have to step in and kind of get surrogates to act in a similar way to help other species, even though there's no recent records of those eucalypts being part of that system. So that's where we're moving into new ground and thinking and conversations and opportunities. But I think our first candidates are those sites that have had the highest impacts and been harassed the most and are changing. So we've got areas of rainforest in East Gippsland at a place called Jones Creek that burnt in 1983 and still hasn't come back as rainforest. So it'd be pointless for us to resist there and keep planting rainforest species hoping it's going to become a rainforest again. That's a place where we might have to think about what's a different future for that landscape. Things that have been great successes for us, like the successful breeding of the eastern bristlebird population translocated from Jervis Bay and eastern Victoria, was because they'd already been doing the emergency planning for translocating those animals for up to 2 years before the Black Summer fires hit.
We're at Wilson's Promontory National Park today. We're standing on a fairly ancient dune system here. Once upon a time we would have been right at the water's edge. The sea would have been lapping at our feet. But gradually...
One of the leaders of this just-in-time extraction was Mark Antos. He and his team monitor Victoria's natural landscapes and species. They're regularly out in the field gathering critical intelligence on vulnerable species and figuring out how to best help them.
Our role is statewide, so whenever our organisation or our partners have a need for technical advice or for assistance with monitoring threatened or endangered species or ecosystems, then we're here to help.
During the 2019-2020 summer, as unprecedented bushfires raged across southeastern Australia, Mark, his team and colleagues from other agencies were really concerned about the fate of this small threatened bird. It was right in the line of fire.
Bristlebirds are a funny creature. They don't really look or behave like a bird. They're more like a mammal. Even though they've got feathers and wings, they choose not to use the wings too much. They'll run around through the understory like a little rat, which doesn't make them sound overly appealing, but once you get to know them, they're just delightful little creatures. They are brown. They're not super colourful, but they make up for that drab brown plumage by having this really bright red eye, like a glowing ember. They don't often let you see that because they're pretty sneaky, but every now and again you'll just catch a brief glimpse of a bristlebird. When the sun hits the eye, it just glows and sends shivers down your spine. And also, they've got the most wonderful song, a very rich, wild, melodious song that they often use in the springtime especially. And they've got a unique behaviour. The scientists call it antiphonal duetting. So in basic terms, it means that the male bird will start the song and the female will finish it. And when you hear them both doing that together, you can tell that love is in the air and good times are coming up for the bristlebird. And that's what we like to hear out there when we're looking for bristlebirds. 9 times out of 10, we don't see the birds. We hear them. So using our ears to listen for those very distinctive calls is our primary method of detecting the bristlebird. The bristlebird is probably about the size of a blackbird, so most people would be familiar with seeing introduced blackbirds around your garden. The bristlebird is actually a similar size, shape, and often has similar behaviour, feeding on the ground and hopping around. And the bristlebird represents a very ancient lineage of evolution. So it's one of the early songbirds, not just for Australia, but for the whole world. They aren't found anywhere else in the world, just in Australia. And their current distribution is very tenuous. They're just clinging to the edge of our continent.
This quirky native bird was once found all over eastern Australia. But now, due to changes in climate, severe habitat loss and the addition of pest species such as feral cats and foxes, they're only found scattered in a few locations near the sea, from southeastern Queensland down to far eastern Victoria.
Because they're found in these few tiny isolated remnants, it obviously means they're super vulnerable to extinction, which places the onus on us as land managers to elevate the importance of conserving that species.
Mark and his team realised that an important eastern bristlebird population, genetically distinct from others up the East Australian coast, was in the direct path of the spreading black summer bushfires. A small population of about 180 birds persisted at a place called Howe Flats, near Mallacoota, right in the southeast corner of New South Wales and Victoria. They knew they had to act quickly.
When the fires were raging, they took us all by surprise. If people remember, the main fire front of that far East Victorian complex really went crazy on New Year's Eve. So everybody was in holiday mode. And literally overnight, we had half of East Gippsland turned from a range of lush, green, vibrant ecosystems to charcoal and ash. And we quickly started thinking, what does this mean for all of the biodiversity in eastern Victoria? And we tried to rank which species might be the most important and the most at risk, and there were many. The bristlebird was just one, but the unique thing about the bristlebird situation was that little patch of habitat where we had that solitary population at Howe Flat was still unburnt.
Mark and his team decided that this population of eastern bristlebirds was at risk of disappearing entirely, especially when it was the only population left in Victoria. The obvious question was, what could they do to save it?
We could actually try to fight the fire and stop it, which was a bit of a risky bet given how hot the fires were burning. And the other thing that we could do, because the population was still intact, and this was a fairly bold idea at the time, we could actually go in there just before the fire got there, grab as many as we could and get them the hell out of there, out of harm's way. And then we'd think about what we do with those birds later, once the emergency had passed.
So Mark and a coalition of the willing went to the Victorian Minister of Environment, Energy and Climate Action for support.
And in the back of my mind, I was just thinking, what can we actually do to convey how grave the situation is? And I just said, there's a very real chance that as a result of this event, we're going to lose species from Victoria. And straight away, a question was fired back at me. Which ones? And straight away, eastern bristlebird came to my mind.
Even before the fires started, a collaboration between the Department of Environment, Energy and Climate Action, Parks Victoria, Zoos Victoria and others had been doing the groundwork to set up a new eastern bristlebird population as a sort of insurance policy to prevent local extinction. Unfortunately, the fires were so big and fast, they'd already burnt the proposed location for the new population, so they looked further afield, to Wilson's Promontory. Once we had the Minister's support, it was all systems go.
The extraction was a bit of a blur. Everything happened so fast. So if you can imagine trying to get all the planning done, all the personnel together, and all the permits and permissions to get a critically endangered species out of its habitat and remove it and take it somewhere else, it's a huge process. Ordinarily, I reckon it would have taken us 3 or 4 months to line all those ducks up. We basically did it in a week and a bit. So things moved super fast. Everybody worked so hard. Everyone worked long hours and nights to get all the paperwork done, all the permits through, to contact all the people, get a team together, and also the actual logistics, getting people into one of the remotest bits of Victoria with a whole bunch of equipment into an active fire ground, and then getting them out again with a bunch full of endangered species was no easy feat. People started looking around at all the resources we had at our disposal, and just by sheer chance, we had assistance from the Singapore Air Force. So they were here with their aircraft, helping with the firefighting effort, and they just happened to have a Chinook helicopter at their disposal, and we thought, that's our way in. The flight in from Melbourne into Mallacoota was a bit of a heartbreaking experience because we were in the helicopter. The helicopter flew very low and followed the coast. So basically, since we left Bairnsdale, going further east, we noticed that we weren't seeing the golden beach, the green vegetation and the blue sea anymore. We were just seeing grey everywhere, as far as the eye could see. Even up into the hills and the foothills, all the way to the high tide mark in East Gippsland was just grey and burnt to a crisp. So it was really disheartening, and the gravity of the situation really hit. Everyone was just pretty much silent, just, gazing at this devastation. It was a feeling of, helplessness, and we were all fairly demoralised and upset, but at the same time, it also made us think we better really do our best here and try and give these birds that are stuck at the end of our flight in this perilous position the best possible chance of survival.
Mark and his team were ferried into this incredibly remote part of Victoria and got to work straight away.
Seeing that helicopter fly off over the horizon one way, then looking over your shoulder the other way and seeing the smoke column from the fire, you kind of realise the situation that you were in.
With the fire fast approaching and ash raining down on them, they tried to catch as many birds as they could, which, as you can imagine, is not an easy task.
So we have to use fairly specialised methods to catch birds. One of the techniques is called mist netting. It's where we use a net. It's a monofilament net, and it's black. It's very fine. That's where the term mist comes from, because it's meant to look like a very fine mist. And if we place that net carefully in a shady spot and out of the wind, it is nearly invisible. So basically, as the bird goes about its daily business, the theory is it flies into the net. The bristle birds posed an extra challenge for us. Remember, I mentioned that they behave more like a mammal than a bird? It means they run on the ground. So they don't often fly. The amount of times we had a net set up and we saw a bird fly up to the net, duck its head down under the net and run out the other side was infuriating. You'd come so close to catching it and you kind of say, look, we're doing this for your own good, just cooperate with us, get in the net already. But they were tricky. So we had all sorts of techniques we had to think of on the run. The other ace that we had up our sleeve was we had recordings of the birds' territorial song. The males are quite enthusiastic about defending their territory. So all it takes for you to prompt them to respond with the bird equivalent of bravado and aggression is you just play a snippet of their call. And they'll come in to see what the hell's happening here, who's this? Then if you keep playing the call, they get all roughed up and they're ready for a fight. So we placed speakers on either side of the net so we could control them and we could see what direction the bird was coming in. So invariably you play the speaker on the other side of the net. And then the birds, 9 times out of 10, would furiously hurl themselves into the net and we'd come running out, grab them and put them in the bag and get all the measurements and do all the checks.
While all this was happening, the fires were getting ever closer.
We did not realise the enormity of the situation. We all had a job to do. We had so much to do. It was only every now and again that you'd literally have time to take a breath and look over your shoulder and see the smoke column getting closer or hear the water bombing aircraft overhead. When it did sink in that it looked like the how flat habitat and population might be lost to fire, it was a bit of a strange feeling because you'd be walking through this pristine habitat full of threatened species. It wasn't just the bristlebirds in there. We were seeing things like ground parrots, beautiful firetails. It's also an important population area for diamond pythons. So it's this repository of biodiversity in really good condition. And walking through it, especially on that Wednesday morning, you kind of couldn't help but think, geez, am I the last person to have seen this area before it gets razed to the ground? And it really hit home and made you feel really, really sad, and it's a bit hard to describe in words, but it was a lot to process.
The team thought they had more time, but it was quickly running out. In the end, they only had 3 full days before the fire was too close and too dangerous and they had to evacuate.
By the end of Wednesday morning, the fire was too close to stay. So we weren't really expecting to get such a short window of time to catch the birds.
They knew from Zoos Victoria that they needed at least 10 to 20 birds to give them a good insurance population.
Despite all the challenges, we were able to catch 16 birds in that truncated window of opportunity that we had.
Transporting the birds wasn't easy. Each day, the caught birds were carefully carried in their own wooden box to a 4-wheel drive, which then drove them to a boat, which then transported them across an inlet to Mallacoota, and then they were put in a Chinook helicopter and flown to Essendon. From there, Zoos Victoria picked them up to take care of them until they could be rehomed.
After the emergency extraction, we entered into a different phase of eastern bristlebird conservation. So we still needed that magic insurance population somewhere else in the state. We thought, let's release them at Wilson's Promontory, because we thought that is a far enough distance to create a true insurance population. And a lot of the habitat at Wilson's Promontory looks perfect for eastern bristlebirds, but there's never been a confirmed record down here. The other thing that also came into play with choosing Wilson's Promontory as a location for an insurance population was the Prom Sanctuary project. We knew that there was going to be a lot of work invested into the Prom to manage the habitat, to manage threats such as inappropriate fire and predators. So it became a logical, safe landing ground for these endangered birds.
After the fires, thankfully only 10% of the How Flat habitat was impacted. Many of the birds saved during this process were able to go safely back to their original homes. Some of the birds became founders of a new insurance population that's been set up at Wilson's Promontory. This new population has since been supplemented by more bristlebirds from How Flat and 2 groups of bristlebirds brought from Jervis Bay in New South Wales. This brings genetic diversity to the population, and they appear to be thriving.
Following the release of the population at the Prom, there's been a lot of concerted monitoring effort. Last time we monitored the population was in October, last spring. We ended up detecting a minimum, I think, of 21 individuals. Given that we released a total of 27, that's an exceptional detection rate. None of us was expecting to detect quite so many of them. So yeah, we were just over the moon. Also, when you look at those numbers, we think that there's a high chance for us to have detected so many birds that they must have bred. And that is super exciting. So it means that the birds that we transported found their new home to their liking, they adapted, and obviously it was good enough for them to start raising little families.
This project builds on past successes in the recovery and re-release into the wild of native species like the eastern barred bandicoot. Similar projects are being developed across the state by Parks Victoria and our partners, DECA and Zoos Victoria. This includes for tiny mammals like the pacula or New Holland mouse and the brush-tailed rock wallaby. Under climate change, we know that more large-scale fires, floods and weather extremes are likely, and we need to be as prepared as possible. Actions need to be decided, planned and ready to go.
You hope you never have to pick the plan up and enact it, but it just saves that situation that we found ourselves in with the bristlebirds, where we were literally thinking on the run and everybody was under so much pressure to get the teams together, to get all the permits together at the last minute. We can now predict quite safely that unfortunately these events will continue to occur. So it is our responsibility to be fully prepared for that eventuality.
Insurance populations is a kind of a concept of making sure you've hedged your bet across multiple places. It's about having safe havens around the landscape for those species in critical need. Similarly, under a sort of an insurance option, There's captive breeding in zoos. They call it in situ protection, where you're doing things within the natural setting. And then there's ex situ, which means outside where they normally live. And that might include things like seed banks where plant seeds and cultivated conservation horticulture seedlings breed up species that are in trouble elsewhere so that they persist and they maintain their genetic diversity. So Museums Victoria Research Institute's developing the fauna sort of seed bank equivalent. And then Botanic Gardens has a seed bank that they're growing, and conservation horticulture is growing as a concept. And when you think about something really rare like the Wollemi pine and how much trouble it was in, and now you can buy it at your local nursery, that species is not going extinct on our watch. That's a really critical role that those off-site insurance options kind of exist. So there's things like that you can do around culturally important plant species, around critically endangered plant species, and then for fauna, we just try and spread it across as many options as we can. So it's just hedging your bet against that unpredictability is a really important factor. It's a constant dialogue, it's communication and partnerships, it's the potential to bring back and reintroduce those animals back into systems when it's more stable or when it's more appropriate, or their numbers are big enough now that they're likely to persist against other threats. So it's very much about a network and a dialogue and a network amongst sort of sanctuaries and havens and parks and reserves between states and right around the country. So it's just got huge potential. The fact we've brought bristlebirds from Jervis Bay in New South Wales here as an emergency backup is a really positive sort of hedge your bets approach to keeping the species from going extinct. So it's ended up being a role that Victoria can really play, and of course the parks and reserves are the most important places and the most healthy places to try and do those projects. I think this has to change our mindset, and the RAD framework, the Resist, Accept, Direct framework, helps us with that conception, in that if you think of sort of Western conservation, probably started really getting momentum in the late 60s through Silent Spring and other kind of conservation leads in the space. It's had a kind of resist-only mindset. It's just we're going to put it back as it was, or reconnect it as it was, or try and build a concept of wilderness that is a bit static. It's a bit flat earth to go, we're just getting it back to this state. And so the thing about the RAD framework is you still resist where there's point in resisting at somewhere like Wilson's Promontory through the Prom Sanctuary project. But let's be realistic about other systems and not just keep pushing the huge boulder uphill pointlessly. The accept and the direct is being honest but proactive, and so it gives you outlets to go and do emergency extractions or set up insurance populations somewhere else or put things in seed banks. It kind of turns it into almost a pre-war setting, which is far more constructive than either denying or despairing, and it goes back to the early Al Gore quotes of there's a lot of space between denial and despair. I think this is really proactive and action focused. So it's not descriptions of what's happening to the system, resilience or transition. The terms and the mindset is one of acting. We resist where it's appropriate. We accept what we can't change, but do other constructive things. And then we direct where we can provide a better future for native species that need that support and keep the threats off them. And think of it as a new nature kind of combination.
My dream for 10 to 20 years for bristlebirds at the Prom is that they're so common that they transition from the ranks of being an endangered and elusive bird to becoming what we call a car park bird. So birds that literally just turn up at car parks and picnic sites, just because the habitat's been so well managed, because the predators have been controlled, and because the population is doing so well.
Parks Victoria helps manage the best examples of natural and cultural values in Victoria, and we are trying to find the best ways to help nature in challenging times. But everybody can lean into this. There is no situation where nature doesn't or couldn't benefit from your help or your input or somebody's input, even if it's just butterflies that are joining a pot plant on a balcony of an apartment block that's critical food for a species that needs our help. And so the more we can do to help what is the natural riches of, and very important biocultural kind of riches of this state, the more we can do the better, and that can apply across every part of your life, from curbside native gardens to what you have in pot plants, to what you do with your free time, what you do with your volunteering, where you give material or physical support to big conservation programs. It all helps, and the need is there. And yeah, the turning away as if it's too hard is kind of the easy route. I think everybody's really got to lean into this stuff. Thanks for listening to Closer to Nature. I'm Mark Norman, and thanks to my guest Dr Mark Antos for speaking with us. That was our final episode for the season. I hope you enjoyed it and learnt a little more about the wonderful natural places and species in Victoria, and what we and our many partners are doing to protect them, and how even the smallest actions on your part can help nature in its time of need. Come visit our parks and experience the wonders of nature. Closer to Nature is a Parks Victoria podcast. This episode was produced by Liz McKenzie, Ben Francischelli, Paddy Naughtin, and hosted by me, Dr Mark Norman. Production and sound design by Laura Brierley Newton from Audiocraft, and production support from Olivia O'Flynn, also from Audiocraft. We'd love to know what you think, so please subscribe to Closer to Nature and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts.